Good afternoon from Scotland and the rest of UK. Good morning to Roddy, our chairman, who's in the USA, and wherever you are in the world, good morning or good afternoon to you. My name is Martin Perbrick. I'm the Institute Director of the Asia Scotland Institute. Our focus today is a presentation and discussion of the subject of developing a balanced relationship with China. We're certainly not prejudging whether that's possible, but certainly discussing the subject itself, which is quite complex. And I'd suggest that how the world manages the economic rise of China is one of the defining issues of our times, and it's proving one of the more complex issues also. Clearly, there's no joint strategy amongst the EU, USA, and UK to manage this economic rise of China or to engage with China. The EU, as we know recently, has agreed a trade deal with China. The US government under President Trump pursued a strategy of somewhat more confrontation with China on certain issues, and the UK government does not seem to have a strategy. So there is increasingly strident rhetoric in the UK, and there has been for some time in the USA from some political groups calling for China to be confronted on a range of issues. And broadly, I think these are human rights in Xinjiang and Tibet, democracy in Hong Kong, threats made to Taiwan, a complex issue in itself, the 9-dash line in the South China Sea and sovereignty and maritime access to those waters, intellectual property rights in China, economic espionage, and of course 5G and its global expansion, and notably the involvement of Huawei. So that's an extremely complex range of issues that, taken together, could derail any engagement with China, and hence they need to be carefully managed. The human rights and democracy issues are highly emotive, and they're resonating with a growing number of people in Western countries. So to discuss this situation, we have a group of three people who all have very deep and broad experience in China and dealing with China and working with China, I should say. Professor Kerry Brown is a director of the Lao China Institute at King's College, former professor of Chinese politics and director of Chinese Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. I would suggest Kerry's both an academic and a practitioner, if that's okay with you, Kerry. From 1998 to 2005, he worked for the British Foreign Commonwealth Office as first secretary in the British Embassy in Beijing as one of his postings. From 1994, he lived for several years in Inner Mongolia, I think the northernmost region of China, and has some interesting tales from that. Kerry's the author of over 10 books on modern Chinese politics, history, and language. We also have George Magnus, also, I think, if you don't mind, George, a practitioner turned academic, or academic turned practitioner, I'm not sure which way around you put it, but now an independent economist and commentator, a research associate at the China Centre, Oxford University, and at the School of African and Oriental Studies, London. George was previously chief economist at UBS Investment Bank, and had a long and very successful career in several other investment banks. And George has written multiple books. One of the most notable recent ones on China is Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy, which I think we'd strongly recommend. And lastly, last but not least, Matthew Rouse, who's chief executive of the China-Britain Business Council since 2017. And Matthew has a very long career as a diplomat, 26 years with the Foreign Commonwealth Office. Most recently, one of his latter postings as Consul General in Guangzhou. Matthew read modern medieval languages at Cambridge and subsequently also studied at SOAS. So could I just remind everyone, for attendees today, we're today on the Zoom webinar platform. So the audience cannot immediately come on to audio or video. If you have questions later, we can bring you on, but we'll get to that in due course. So if you'd like to raise questions, and we do encourage questions, we want to make this an interactive session, please raise your questions in the Zoom chat function, either privately to me or publicly to the group if you wish, it's up to you. Or there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get through as many as we can after our three panelists have said something. So with that, could I please just hand over for a few words from Roddy Gao, the chairman and founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, to start the discussion. Over to you, please, Roddy.
Martin, thank you, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. It's terrific to have three so distinguished talking heads on our panel today who we're going to hear from. For us at the Asia Scotland Institute, this topic is key to what we do, and our mission really is, as I think everybody on the panel knows, to increase knowledge and understanding of Pan-Asia for people who are in Scotland and elsewhere, and in particular to educate and inspire tomorrow's leaders, people certainly younger than me, whose future is going to be very much wrapped up in the Asia-Pacific region, and within which, of course, the role of China, India, Japan, and others is going to be absolutely critical. It's actually quite an interesting day to be holding this particular webinar on, because there's the first day of the great meeting of the Chinese Communist Party in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing to chart the country's long-term course to 2035. And that will get a lot of coverage, I think, over the coming days and give us an idea of what the future looks like. Here, of course, where I am in America, we are trying to determine what the new Biden administration policy towards China is going to be. Certainly the new president is surrounded by some very wise people who have worked in this region before. So we're hopeful of some positive developments there. But for all of us, understanding China, understanding its culture and its politics is critical. And so on behalf of the Asia-Scotland Institute, I'm absolutely delighted to have this webinar today. And I'm going to ask Kerry if he could very kindly kick off the discussions. Kerry, thank you.
Great, well, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me today. It's good to see some old colleagues and also to see Martin for the first time, who I have been dealing with for a number of years. I mean, I suppose what I sort of start as a sort of very broad comment for 5 or 7 minutes is to sort of imagine, you know, like the kind of, we've been seeing these pictures from Mars recently using sort of technology. And what if we found, you know, kind of life on Mars, right? And they kind of came to Earth, you know, these beings who had never really had the experience of Earth, you know, what would they kind of look at when they came here? And I mean, they'd see a sort of world where I think they immediately conclude, okay, there's this very big player, America, and there's this very big player, China, okay, and they really don't get on with each other. I mean, no matter what kind of other, you know, conclusions they might make, I suppose that it would be pretty kind of easy to make that judgment. You know, they clearly don't get on. And I suppose I've been thinking a bit about, you know, well, how do you deal with these kind of conflicts when they've never happened on this sort of scale before? You know, in the past, there were sort of parameters where you deal with this sort of falling out, or it could come to the most extreme, you know, kind of military sort of level. And yeah, unfortunately, that's the way it went. When America and the USSR, the Cold War, again, you had a kind of a sort of asymmetry, because in many ways the Soviet Union wasn't integrated into the global economy. It wasn't the kind of capitalist actor that China is. So this is a huge conceptual shift, that the world's most successful practitioner of capitalism, or probably will be in the next 5 to 10 years, is a communist. End of history is not quite as we thought it would end up. It's ended up with, at least on the economic field, what looks likely to be a winner being not at all the kind of figure that we thought. So this is really a kind of conceptually a hard thing to deal with. And I think that's what trips us up. I was actually, and it's not all about China, looking at a book called Conflicted, Why Arguments Are Tearing Us Apart and How They Can Bring Us Together by Ian Leslie. And it's really about kind of issues in America, Europe, and our own societies at the moment, and the way that social media kind of maps this and sorts of other issues. And it has some interesting ideas really about, you know, what do you do and how do you kind of negotiate between parties who are fundamentally different from each other. And reading that book, I kind of thought of, you know, the 3 broad areas where I suppose China and its world, probably that just means China in a way, because it is quite an isolated actor, and the United States and its alliance system, so that also means Europe. How do they kind of, you know, conceptualize their areas of disagreement, and what sort of problems are there in those areas? Now, I mean, I think we can look at, you know, trade issues as being ones where there is serious disagreement, lack of reciprocity, and a whole range of issues which no doubt George and others can talk about with a greater level of knowledge. But it seems to me that those are hard and difficult, but they are probably soluble. You know, and the kind of trade wars in the last few years and the agreements that have come out of those visually are steps bit by bit towards that. So, I mean, tough issues, but soluble. I guess in the middle, we've got kind of, you know, issues where it is, you know, kind of like climate change, public health and things like this, where, well, actually there's an area of commonality. I mean, China and the United States, particularly now that the United States has rejoined the Paris Convention, are, you know, able to talk quite a lot of common language, although there are still disagreements. It seems that this is a benign area, and it's obviously one that's enormously important for the rest of humanity. And then we've got, you know, kind of, I suppose you call them values differences, and into that falls the serious issues in Xinjiang, the serious issues in Hong Kong, the serious issues within China itself, which are intensely looked at. And there, it's really, really hard to see any easy solution. I mean, maybe it's not possible to see a solution. So when we look at this kind of three sets of problems, I think we can't think of a simple policy approach that's going to basically holistically deal with the kind of complexity of the challenges we're dealing with. Policy is, I guess, a normalizer. Policy is a kind of attempt to at least create a common framework and a common platform. But the problem is that the complexity of those three areas for a player like the United Kingdom, for instance, particularly in the situation it's in at the moment, is not going to fall into one particular policy response. When people therefore say, should the UK have a policy towards China, I guess I'm thinking immediately that the policy word needs to become plurality. We need policies. We need, you know, we need a kind of almost like a tri-track policy. And of course, there's going to be enormous amounts of, you know, kind of problems with how do you integrate that into a workable framework, a dynamic framework and a workable framework, and one that can be conveyed by politicians to the public. We see only in the last week this raised in very stark terms when apparently the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, after discussion with business people, said that he continued to be a Sinophile and that he wanted to encourage business with China. So I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but that's, you know, one particular area of policy concentration. But then, of course, we have the Parliament and the particular kind of group, I think the China Research Group in Parliament and others, who are obviously very engaged with the issues over Xinjiang and probably like the Canadian Parliament, wanting this to be kind of prioritized and you know, kind of recognized as genocide. So this, it seems to me to be symptomatic of the real strains on trying to come up with a policy towards a place where, on the one hand, you are having high-level meetings promoting business and saying this is a priority as Britain becomes global Britain and needs to find new partnerships now that the European Union is more distant from us, and China being a fifth of the world's kind of GDP is a very natural partner to look at that. But on the other hand, you also have these severe and severely articulated issues where they seem to create very big boundaries. And again, I'm not making a judgment on that, if that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that seems to me the situation. So if you've got a kind of, you know, very, very big extremes like this, I guess you're going to have to end up with a kind of very messy, you know, kind of approach. The kind of title of the talk is Rebalancing, or More Balanced Relationship. But in a sense, it's hard to do that when we ourselves are unbalanced. I mean, we are trying to carry, first of all, you know, the commercial imperatives and the imperatives to seek growth, particularly after the serious problems of COVID-19 and the impact that that's going to continue to have. But on the other hand, looking at a partner that may be sources for that growth, but is actually going to be politically very antagonized and antagonistic because of these other values issues, which are almost unmanageable. It seems to me very hard for politicians to stand anywhere and say, on the one hand, it's okay for us to do business with a partner who we then also accuse of undertaking genocide. I I think this is a very, very hard thing, particularly if that partner then ends up as your biggest trading partner. So this seems to me to be a political and a moral issue that is very, very hard to sort out. I suppose the only kind of solution to this is that we have to kind of think in a very different way and recontextualize our sort of policy thinking about China. We almost have to treat China as a kind of not one country, but two or three. We have to think of the good China, the neutral China, the bad China. We have to think, therefore, of kind of dual tracking some of our policies so that there are areas where anything attaching related to Xinjiang would need to be removed from sort of supply chains. I don't know how viable that is. I know that's what's being attempted at the moment, but it's very, very difficult. But we also have to have other areas where there are lines of access. My final point is one that I have no solution to. I don't think anyone would have a solution to at the moment, but it's really to raise the sharpest quandary of all. In the situation, it's possible, it's perfectly possible, where on climate change, for instance, with the urgency of that issue and with a manifest increase of the importance of that, on global health, well-being, across the board, human survival. What happens when, in the future, China may have solutions to this? It may be technologically, devising ways in which this problem is solved. I mean, it's become soluble. But at the same time, of course, maybe the human rights issues and values issues and differences with China become even more extreme. So I think there we have the kind of biggest moral quandary of all. I don't want to get utilitarian about this. I don't know how we would deal with this, but on the one hand, it seems to me that there is the strongest possible imperative to work with a partner who could help solve this greater problem. But there's also very serious issues of working with a partner, of course, who is going to arouse particular issues about, their particular, more localized, but very, very serious, differences in values. How do we embrace those differences of view and values, I think, when they can be so extreme, is, I think, a really urgent issue. I don't think that policymakers and politicians are alone in dealing with this and should be left alone in dealing with this. I think it means that we almost need a united front in Britain and elsewhere within our own communities to try and come out with an ethical and political framework that tries to square this extraordinary circle that we are sort of presented with. So I'm afraid on that somewhat conflicted and agonized note, I will now hand back to the chair. And thank you, and look forward to your comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Kerry, thank you very much. I don't think we would have expected you in 10 minutes to provide the solution, although some might. But before we pass over to George, could we just deal with one question from someone in the audience? Andrew Seaton has asked, into which of your three areas of difficulty between China and the West would you put the South China Seas and related issues?
Well, Andrew, of course, is a wise and knowledgeable figure about this. I mean, I think that is, so if you think of soluble or insoluble, I think that that's soluble. If only because there are pragmatic inducements to all sides to kind of come up with a kind of solution, even though it might not be immediately visible. So I think that that's probably in the more neutral territory, although that might just be an indication of just how severe the problematic territory is. I'm not saying that the South China Sea or any of these territorial issues are soluble, but I guess in the long-term future they might be. I can't see the values issues being things that can be solved because they're so tied with people's identity and the way that they view the world. To change that means that you have to change the people believing those things, and that's incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So George, could we ask you just to talk a little bit about your own views on this extremely broad subject?
Sure. I mean, I can't remember exactly how Kerry finished. You said something about like conflicted and agonized, which I think is pretty much a great description. And your words were very wise. I mean, not just those words, but the preceding words as well. So the question of the approach, as Kerry's already outlined and depicted, it's a, to put it mildly, a tricky question for what is sort of our main drama in at least this part of the 21st century. And I think there's a serious danger being pulled in kind of two different directions. One is into this sort of siege mentality view, which is, you know, China's inevitable rise. There's nothing we can do about it. It's going to eat our lunch in, you know, economics, science, and technology. And the other extreme is one of overconfidence or complacency, which is that, you know, it's all kind of rhetoric and, you know, obviously there are kind of constituencies which include, you know, companies that have very strong vested interests, governments that find themselves either in very, very difficult situations about how to behave vis-a-vis China and where they actually sit between China and the United States as to what their behavior should be. So trying to steer that sort of middle way, I think, is extremely tricky and does require, as you've already heard, you know, the calibration of carefully calibrated policy. So a couple of points I'd just like to kind of go through in this kind of introduction, really. The first is, again, as Kerry's already outlined, I mean, China is not the adversary we have known from the past. You know, the Soviet Union in the 1960s was a very strong ideological rival, but never really matched in terms of economic rivalry. Europe in the 1970s and Japan in the 1980s were both without question very strong economic rivals, but never ideological adversaries. And China is both. And so, you know, looking back at the past for templates as to how to manage a contemporary situation, I think is obviously mistaken as a consequence. One thing that does bother me and worries me a lot, actually, is that the agonizing over what sort of relationship we should have with China often seems to be something that is actually the property of liberal-leaning democracies alone, and not necessarily something which we sense China does agonize about, even though it might well do so. So our concerns about values, human rights, rule of law, democratic beliefs, shaken though they sometimes have been in recent months and years, remain kind of great concern to us in ways which we assume that actually they are not in China, and certainly not for the Communist Party, which has, in Xi Jinping's own words, stated that it is on a mission, quote, to better our own affairs, continually broaden our comprehensive national power, build a socialism that is superior to capitalism, and win the initiative and have the dominant position. I mean, that sounds pretty uncompromising to me, even though the reality is certainly, at least in the interim period ahead, maybe not quite as extreme. But leaving aside many of the things which we've already heard about and we know about that are difficult to manage, if not impossible, Taiwan, South China Sea, for example, I do think this means that that China is not lacking in intent as to what it is that it wants to achieve. But I don't think it either seeks the kind of militaristic or strong kind of solutions which we thought the Soviet Union was capable of implementing by virtue of having contiguous borders and massed land armies kind of looking at each other. But nevertheless, obviously, China's kind of modus operandi is to look for and secure compliance with and support for its actions and desires and strategies through influence, which we all use, but also through competition and occasionally interference. So I often ask the question, really, that what happens if we really want to try to reach a modus vivendi with China on those things that we think we can, but actually China's kind of long game actually is to leverage these things against liberal democracies in the longer term, based on its own values. So I think that the engagement question actually does require this calibration and a recognition that even though we have common interests in climate control, public health, sustainable development goals, peacekeeping, the openness of trade, the functionality of global institutions, these are all things about which we can have, I'm sure, discussions and conversations. they nevertheless also intersect at a very, very critical point where nowadays, of course, economic and national security basically are locking horns. And these encompass industry, investment, information systems, and innovation, which are all very, very sensitive matters for us individually, of course, but also collectively as we look at the various aspects of security. For China, I mean, my judgment really is that national security is indistinguishable from the security of the Communist Party's control and rule, and therefore of Xi Jinping's position himself. In fact, the 14th five-year plan, which we're going to see many of the details lifted or the blanket lifted during the next few days, for the first time will have a standalone section on national security. Other forms of security for China, which range from food, employment, technology, self-reliance, social stability, and the environment, are all important in their own right, but they're also integral to this bigger political objective, along with the issues of territorial integrity, about which China is quite adamant. For the Americans and the Brits and the Europeans, by contrast, national security, we are latecomers to this kind of idea that economic and national security are really kind of joined at the hip. And therefore, when it comes to economic, financial, and commercial spheres, we obviously have a lot of catching up to do and a lot of kind of rethinking to do about what we think is important. So we see a lot, really. We'll have to see what it translates to in practice about President Biden's aspirations to strengthen alliances. We see a lot about, how nowadays about how China's own behavior and actions, coercive diplomacy, for example, constitute impediments to its own aspirations. And a lot that I think we will have to see and concentrate on as we negotiate with China, which I am sure we will in many respects, on promoting our own domestic economic strengths and systems and assets in order to influence what we can influence, because we obviously can't influence China's politics or China's chosen course into the future. So in conclusion, I would say that my own view is that our approach to China inevitably has to be based on the fact of realities that China is certainly the second biggest economy in the world. It might become the biggest. Quite what that means, apart from bragging rights, remains to be seen. It's also the heart of the world trading system and world supply chains. And it's deeply integrated into the global economy and into the sources of revenues and profits of a very, very large number of global firms. So that there must be engagement, I think, is something that probably most people have accepted as inevitable. There are some naysayers, but I think we have to try to kind of marginalize them. But also recognize, of course, that China has vested interests like this too. I mean, there is a very strong program of self-reliance, which they're about to lift the lid on this week and next week as well, particularly in areas like semiconductors, which are at the heart of all advanced technologies, and on which, of course, the Chinese economy is very heavily dependent still on the rest of the world. But these new realities of economic dependency and constraint really actually will inevitably, I think, be part of the kind of engagement that we engage with, and it will be quite different from anything that we have done in the past. Martin.
George, thank you very much. You've covered issues there. I should point out to everyone attending this, actually, I think just yesterday, or certainly earlier this week, George had a new article published with a publication called War on the Rocks, and the title is Economics, National Security and the Competition with China. If you do a quick Google search on George Magnus, the first news result you'll see is this article from George, which talks a little bit about some of the points he just made, and I think well worth reading. Before we go to Matthew, could I just ask you a little bit about that, George? Because if you don't mind, a two-part question. Firstly, in relation to your article and some of what you just said, and whether you think national security is now or is going to become the primary influence on the economic policies of both China and the USA. I think you seem to suggest that for China it currently is. And I think that's probably in reference to your article. But secondly, there's a very interesting question just come up in the Zoom chat from Giles, sorry, from Andy, I beg your pardon, not from Giles. So Andy, do George or Kerry believe that the sheer critical mass of the Chinese economy at a certain point, should it continue to grow its GDP significantly faster than the US and the West do, become a matter of serious strategic concern for the US and Europe? So that even if the human rights values issues were somehow overcome, the sheer relative magnitude of the Chinese economy and the corresponding geoeconomics power becomes immensely problematic. And I sense that that relates back to the national security question of driving economic policy. Would you like just to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, because obviously we have still quite a lot of stuff to go through. I mean, I think if I can take the two parts and kind of try and answer them as though it were one question and single answer. I mean, without sort of making any kind of acknowledgement really about to President Trump's America First kind of slogan. I mean, China has been pursuing China First policies for quite a long time in industry and in technology and so on. And actually, I don't think there's any kind of surprise really that it has used its economic heft as the platform on which to base its model, so to speak, to its citizens and to the rest of the world. And so we recognize China for what it is, both in terms of the enormity of its success to date and of the threat that it poses, because it is such an economic heavyweight. So, you know, that we should be latecomers to this idea. I mean, I don't think we've ever not known that economic and national security are joined, but I don't think we've, in the Western world at least, I don't think we've really taken it very seriously. And I think maybe that was for lots of other reasons that we could discuss about the way in which we have perceived China in the past and the way in which that's now changed for a number of different reasons. But I think that we must, I mean, there are lots of things that will determine whether China's GDP, I mean, whether it's, you know, this, in 10 years' time, it's the same size as the United States, or whether it's bigger than the United States, in my own view, is kind of neither here nor there. I mean, it is certainly a kind of an issue for bragging, no question about it. But obviously, in terms of income per head, you know, China is still going to be a long way off the OECD by 2035, 2040, even though its goal is to join, as it were, the lower ranks of that OECD pecking order by 2035. If that's possible, I think the key issue really is, you know, whether what are the keys to development? What actually drives successful economic development? It's not just a question of deploying physical labor and capital, which is behind the Chinese model for the last 40 years. It then becomes much more about productivity and about your robust institutions that allow productivity to be higher than it has been in the past. And these are huge questions which the Chinese themselves are aware of and will be trying to answer when they, you know, discuss these issues during the next few days. But I think that I'm just to make sure that I answer the question. I mean, the magnitude of the Chinese economy obviously is what makes it what it is, and makes China, for us at least, kind of a geopolitical issue.
Thank you very much, George. Matthew, from either a Foreign and Commonwealth Office or a CBPC perspective, or both, over to you, please.
Well, definitely not Foreign Office. I can't claim to speak for the UK government in any way. Look, so we're talking about a balanced relationship today, and it's great to be part of this discussion. I think that the immediate challenge is that phrase, balanced relationship, means different things to different people in the current debate. And if you're not careful, that leads to misunderstanding. For some, I fear it is used as a slogan to promote avoiding difficult choices. The idea being that you can have your cake and eat it. You can carry on with the tremendous commercial advances of the so-called golden era, while taking a more robust approach on some of the more difficult issues, and blithely assuming that there will be no consequences to that. Whereas I think most of us accept that, first of all, any successful bilateral relationship, not just the one with China, but any successful bilateral relationship, needs to sort of focus attention on and nurture all of its pillars. So in the case of China, certainly that starts with the political and the diplomatic, and there are really important areas where cooperation is urgently needed that have been identified already in this discussion, including climate change and public health and sustainable development, particularly in South Asia and Africa, where China is increasingly a regional player. So that definitely has to be attended to. But then there is also the economic and commercial, and then there is also the agenda around culture and education and values. And how do you do all those things at the same time is what we are trying to eke out in this discussion. The growing consensus is that the UK lacks a China strategy, which looks at all of these things in the round, and that we need a much better understanding of China. We need education to increase our knowledge in the UK of China, which is pretty woeful. I mean, there is a desperate imbalance when you compare the level of awareness of China in the UK compared to the level of awareness of the UK and other major Western countries, I would add, in China. So where does the business pillar come into this? Because I guess I'm in this discussion to be the voice of business. It's an incredibly and increasingly important commercial relationship. 2020 will not have been the best year for British exports. We've got the figures on goods. We don't have the figures yet on services. It looks like if you strip out crude oil and non-monetary gold and focus on core exports, our exports to China will have gone up something like 2% last year, which is pretty good record in the midst of a global pandemic. And if you compare that with the States, which is down something like 18%, or Japan down 12%, EU down by a similar figure, that's very important. And research which my organisation, the China Britain Business Council, has commissioned from Cambridge Econometrics, the independent global economic consultancy, shows that therefore accounts for something like 100,000 or up to 130,000 jobs in the UK economy. So it's a very important set of equities we have there. And I would suggest, when you factor into that also 120,000 students a year coming to UK universities before the pandemic, bringing in £2 billion worth a year, or 7% of universities' global revenues in this country. If you factor in tourism, where you've got nearly 900,000 visits a year and nearly another 2 billion, you can see that there's a lot of stake for us. How do you go about continuing to nurture that and to exploit that? Well, so the first point I would make by way of a tentative resolution to this discussion is I've not come across anyone in the business community, I haven't come across anyone at all, who thinks that you succeed by ignoring the abuses, that you turn a blind eye to Hong Kong or Xinjiang or the South China Sea. That's bad diplomacy, that's bad statesmanship, but it's also bad for business, because this is the age of corporate social responsibility. Customers really care, consumers really care about ethical procurement, and businesses in the UK, certainly CBBC members, want to do the right thing. But to practice that effectively, you do need more than guidelines. You need an ongoing, profound dialogue between business and government, which helps to define and promote best practice. And that's difficult at the moment. The regulatory environment is changing. You've got the National Security and Investment Bill still going through Parliament, which I think business has accepted in principle as a necessary piece of information that you need to have control around how investment comes into this country. But you don't fight unfairness with further unfairness. You need to make sure that the regime you put in place is fair and transparent and equitable for all. And that means it has to be actor agnostic. It mustn't single out China. The second point I would make is that we need to cherish business as part of our equities in the relationship, particularly in relationships with countries where the values overlap is perhaps less big than it is with Europe or with the United States or Japan. The size and significance of the business relationship becomes all that more central to the impact that we achieve. And I would suggest that what Britain's businesses in China deliver, every British branded product that they sell, every student or every tourist that they bring to the UK is a small win for UK soft power, and we need to maintain that as a key element if we are to hope to come to any resolution on the more difficult issues. And the third point I would make, I suppose, is that no country should attempt to do this on their own. It's not going to be productive to try and go it alone. I don't want to say too much about the D10 initiative, the so-called 10 democracies, which we may hear of much more as we approach the G7, which the UK is hosting this year. But clearly there are risks there that initiatives such as that can be seen as hostile, can be seen as an attempt at encirclement. But you need to have a common understanding with your partners. And in the past, the West has been quite fractured at times. I mean, look at the time that Prime Minister Cameron met the Dalai Lama. There is a return. If we have a return to those days, the risk is that one country stands up on its own, and the others don't fall in, and the business simply goes elsewhere. So you need to approach these really difficult issues with intelligence, and beware the law of unintended consequences when it comes to any attempt to decouple, whether it's economically or politically or technologically. One last word before I hand back to you, and that's simply on the issue of technology. I mean, remember, increasingly this is a two-way exchange, and there may come a point soon where the UK relies more on Chinese technology than China does on our technology. I think this is already close to being true in some of the areas that we will be looking to see progress on at COP26, the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow in November. China leads the world in green technologies such as batteries for electronic vehicles. Mobile payments, high-speed rail, 5G, these are all areas where we are going to need to manage the implications of an imbalance in the development between the two countries. And some of that, I would argue, has to be addressed through increasing investment in our own education systems and in our own innovation. But head-on confrontation is not going to be an effective solution. I think that's probably enough by way of an introduction, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Sorry, I wasn't suggesting you're speaking for the FCO, but you speak with the authoritative experience of 26 years as a diplomat, which shines through in many of your comments there, so thank you very much. And you made a very good point about balance. The word balance can have a lot of different meanings, and I'm sorry, it's rather a broad term in this title as well, a balanced relationship with China. It might not even be possible. It might be something we aspire to. But can I just go a little further about balance in relation to our economic relationship with China? So you mentioned there'd been a 2% increase in value of our trade with China last year. So I understand from UK government figures that the value of the trade deficit with China, so the UK does have a trade deficit with China, is about 18 billion pounds. So the understanding at a very broad level from those figures is the UK has a small surplus, trade surplus with China in services, but a significant deficit in manufactured goods. Obviously, the UK is largely a service-based economy, and China is still largely a manufacturing-based economy. So in terms of balance, should that change? Can it change? And will it change? Is that something we should aspire to in terms of that trade balance? Should we have greater access to financial and consulting and business management services to China? Is that something that British businesses should aspire to?
It's absolutely something we should aspire to, and it's absolutely something on which CBBC and our members have been working for a number of years now. I don't want to encourage too simplistic an understanding of the situation, because actually there are certain areas where the UK is doing extremely well in terms of exporting goods, physical goods to China, particularly in consumer goods space, fashion, food and drink. These are areas which have benefited hugely from the e-commerce boom in recent years, and it's much easier to sell directly into China using e-commerce than it has been in the past. But you're right to say that the UK economy is strongly focused on the services sector. It's our area of great strength, and I think that what we should be focused on much more than the prospect of a trade deal, which is much talked about. Rather than focusing on that, it would be much more productive to ensure that the mechanisms that are already in place, which are essentially political dialogues that take place between the ministers on the two sides on roughly an annual basis, including in the economic and financial dialogue and in the JETCO discussions on trade, that they should seek ways to open up China's domestic markets. Financial and professional services, certainly huge opportunities there. UK banks hold a very small market share in China's domestic banking at the moment, and it would be to the benefit of China itself if Chinese banks, if British banks came in more. It would drive up standards, and it would make for much more transparency. So yeah, it's a very important agenda, and one that we need to embrace enthusiastically.
Thank you very much. That's very good timing, because we have an interesting question just come in on in chat from Tariq, and if you don't mind, Tariq, it relates to a question I already had prepared for Kerry. So Kerry, in the Financial Times today, that there is an interesting article relating to a recent report describing the dependency of UK universities on China, and that dependency creates risks of financial dependency, obviously, intellectual property theft, and exploitation by China as an economic rival. Those are quite strong terms. I'm not suggesting that's correct, but that's a sort of outline of the risks from the report. If I can just read a brief paragraph from the FT, I quote, "More than a fifth of British university research in many high-impact science and technology subjects involves collaboration with China, according to a study that urges the UK to urgently improve its monitoring of academic links with an authoritarian regime." Again, quite strong language, and that's the FT, not me. So this is an increasingly difficult problem for universities, and speaking here from Scotland, where we have good links with Scottish universities, and Scottish universities have strong outreach to especially students from the PRC. We have a lot of international students from PRC who are important, and as Matthew said, we want to influence them with our own culture and values. But how does university management approach this? There have been multiple reports in the past several months even, and that influences the political atmosphere. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that, as I've discovered in the work I've done at King's College, risk is kind of assessed in a university. I mean, universities are complex entities most often. Our faculties go from life sciences to humanities and social sciences. And so there are different risks across those areas. And I think one issue is that, well, it's never good to centralize things unless you have to, but in many ways, the kind of fact that there are huge numbers of Chinese students in the UK and we do have a responsibility to them. Also, there obviously are very big research opportunities, rightly, with China on issues like health and climate change, very permissible and important areas, means that, we have to calibrate how we assess risk in those different areas. One of the biggest risks is also that I don't think that universities in Britain or Australia, where I was based before, and indeed the United States, have done a great job at looking after their Chinese students and making them and their voices heard in our institutions particularly well. So there's inequity, I think, kind of sense of inequity on both sides. Look, I mean, it is pretty clear that when you've got the number of Chinese students and the revenue that they contribute, they're very, very big stakeholders. It's also pretty clear that the enormous amounts of funding that the Chinese government are putting into research means that it's going to be an increasingly likely area where there is joint cooperation. It's also pretty clear that there are areas where cooperation is not going to be kind of possible. Artificial intelligence, when it becomes involved in technologies deployed, for instance, Xinjiang and areas like this, of course, this is a very big no-no. The issue, though, generically is exactly the same as that presents itself to states, which is, at what point do you say, okay, we're going to put so much emphasis on this area that it means that we're not going to then kind of basically look at the other area? I mean, economics is basically about opportunity costs. I mean, I guess political science in a way is about opportunity costs. You kind of have to calibrate things so that you say, we're going to draw a boundary, and once we reach that boundary, then we take action. My view is that I think the boundary in this area is an incredibly hard one to draw, and that, in fact, as I said before, the moral quandary is that there are issues which are huge in terms of climate change and public health that mean that they pretty much overshadow everything else. But I also recognize that there are other things which are incredibly important and can't just be ignored. And I don't have an answer, and I don't think we will get an answer to how we draw a meaningful barrier or a meaningful boundary that means that we are able to do the things we have to do. However, we're also able to make sure clear that we are not validating those in others. The final issue, of course, is that, China, as I think Matthew and kind of alluded to, as a partner now where, I don't know, this is a species choice. Can you walk away from such a central partner? No, you couldn't. And the Cold War was happening. You could actually walk away from the USSR in certain areas because it wasn't integrated into the system. It didn't play the game of capitalism particularly well. It didn't play it at all. The point is, as I said right at the beginning, the great issue, and it's never happened before in modernity, is that the world's greatest practitioner of capitalism is a communist country. So we have to work out a bespoke approach to that, even though, of course, good Western universalists, we are resistant to, kind of fracturing our, big frameworks in order to make exceptions. But here, I think we have to make a very big exception.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very direct and somewhat brave answer. And I think you're going to be asked a lot more by the press about that in the coming months, I'm sure. That's going to be a key part of the debate. George, do you mind if we come back to you? I wanted to ask you about decoupling, as you're an economist, and I'm sure you'd have something to say about whether economic decoupling, which has been discussed, is feasible. Has it taken place already to some extent? Is it going to take place? And I wonder if we might relate that across to a question from Steve, who's posted in the chat. Somewhat related back to this word of balance, because Steve said balance assumes status, I think it means stasis, which doesn't really exist, does it? Is it ever possible to achieve balance when the entity we're talking about is constantly changing and growing? That would presumably require equal capacity for change by the West, particularly as China is increasingly capable of sustained growth without reference to US, UK, EU, question mark. So for example, what happens in 10 years when China is developing IT hardware and software solutions beyond anything conceived by or controlled by the US? I think Matthew alluded to that earlier. There will be technology solutions, or there are technology solutions now coming from China that relate to major issues that we're confronting. So what would you like, could you say something about that, George? This question of balance, stasis, and economic decoupling, what's possible?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to take issue with at least part. I'm just leaning across actually because I'm looking at a different screen because my eyesight's not that great anymore. So I'd like to take issue with the central part of the question, which is that China is capable of equal capacity for change, increasingly capable of sustained growth without reference to the US, UK, EU. I don't think that's right, actually. In fact, I mean, most people now acknowledge, and the Chinese leadership knows, that China cannot keep growing at the sort of gangbusters rate that it has done for the last decades. It is slowing down. Okay, the pandemic is creating a lot of noise for China, as it is for everyone else, about what happened last year and what's going to happen this year. But there's no question that China's economy, that the trend in China's economy is slowing down. In fact, the biggest problem that China has nowadays is the same that we have too, which is we just lack productivity growth because it's gone. And in China's kind of developmental context, all of the productivity growth that it was able to harness and very impressively through decades of reform and opening up, for want of a better phrase, that's basically stalled because the whole idea of reform and opening up has reached a kind of a different level of analysis, well, not analysis, but a different level of understanding. The rhetoric of reform and opening up is, of course, still there, but the practice is not as it used to be. Plus, of course, this is the harshest external environment which China is now facing during this decade and the 2030s, one assumes, the harshest environment that it has known since the Mao era. So China was the beneficiary par excellence of accelerated globalization in the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. And my contention is not that globalization is basically going into kind of a sharp reverse, but it's definitely going to be different from what it was. And by different, I mean nowhere near as robust or as expansive. So decoupling enters into this because both China and we are trying to practice it. It's quite difficult given the interdependence that we have on one another. But governments and politicians are doing their damnedest to try to make it happen, notwithstanding what businesses actually would like. So the United States, for example, now has a very, very extensive restraint infrastructure in the Commerce Department, the Congress, the Department of Justice, the Treasury, designed to basically impose on China export controls on key technologies, on firms, on finance, on to impose sanctions, financial sanctions, and trade sanctions, and so on. Other countries in the United Kingdom, the EU, elsewhere, are obviously looking at trade and investment with China under much closer scrutiny about what contravenes and what doesn't contravene national security interest. And of course, what China itself calls self-reliance is really decoupling by another name, because the Chinese are as sensitive to supply chain sensitivities as we have become as well for national security interests. So I do think that the environment in which we engage with China and vice versa during the next 20 years, just pick a number, is going to be radically different from what it has been, and much more circumspect and restrained, I think, than was the case before. Maybe not in every particular case. I mean, American financial firms are having a heyday actually getting access to Chinese financial markets through the agreements that have been reached. And China needs American investment banking and asset management firms and dollars and capital. And there's no reason in principle why British financial firms shouldn't want, you know, the same things, because obviously those are things that we're pretty good at too. Would be nice if we were part of an economic grouping that was capable of using our leverage to get it. But unfortunately, that's no longer the case.
That's a future webinar, I think. It's another big question. Well, actually, we're in Scotland, which is promised to rejoin the European Union, so we will have that as a webinar. Roddy, could I hand back to you in Connecticut for any closing comments or questions?
Yes, you can, Martin. Thank you very much, and thank you so much to the panelists for what's been an extremely interesting overview of the nature of the relationship between the United Kingdom and China. And it sort of begs the question, certainly from Scotland, where there have been very long, deep links between a small country and the very large area that is China, as to how we can actually better leverage that. Because my view, and that of many business people I've talked with, is that Scotland is not leveraging the full potential of its relationship, and there's a great deal more that we should be doing. So I hope we will. But thank you, everybody. And for those who were listening and are asking questions, thank you for that. We depend on your support. So if you feel minded to help us continue to exist, these webinars are at the moment free. I encourage you to do so and to dig deep. But to everybody else, and again, to Matthew, George, and Kerry, thank you very much indeed for an extremely interesting hour. Thank you. And Martin, thank you, and Andrew for arranging it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, George, Kerry. Speak to you soon.
Farewell.
Bye.